Okay, so welcome everyone. Welcome to the multi-criteria decision analysis session, multi-actor multi-criteria analysis. Multi-actor multi-criteria analysis is a framework that is proposed from Cathy Macharis from Free University of Warsaw. I'm the chair of this session. Today we have three presentations for the multi-actor multi-criteria analysis, MAMCA. And the first presenter, the topic today is a criteria pre-processing framework in the multi-actor multi-criteria analysis. So MAMCA is a multi-criteria multi-processing thinking framework which allows the inclusion of multiple stakeholder groups, which they can have different criteria set. So here we can find the structure of MAMCA. You can say that for different stakeholder groups, the members in the group can have different criteria set to evaluate a set of alternatives. Here is the framework of MAMCA. There are 7 steps in MAMCA, which include alternative definition, stakeholder analysis, criteria definition, overall analysis, etc. But it should be noticed that in overall analysis, different MCDA methods can be used in MAMCA, for example, HP, Promote, or lecture. So this is a multi-actor view in MAMCA. So it illustrates the scores from the different stakeholder groups for the different alternatives. So it can show the point of view from different stakeholder groups. But let us focus on the third step, criteria definition and weighting. So in this step, what we need to do first is to define the criteria that will be used in the different stakeholder group for the evaluation. Actually, this is hard step. In the literature, there's no such a formal guideline that helps us, the stakeholders or helps the facilitators or the decision makers to find the suitable criteria. So in this presentation, what we propose is to propose a formal guideline that helps the decision makers to identify and selecting the criteria that will be used in different stakeholder groups. So we call this step as criteria pre-processing, which include the 3 different steps: criteria initial selection, criteria filtering, and criteria final selection. So the first 2 steps, the first criteria initial selection, first we predefine a long list of the criteria that is based on the literature and also validated by different experts that can be possible relevant to the different stakeholder groups. And then in the criteria filtering step, we consider the redundancy, operationality, and also the independency of the criteria. So, in case to avoid the double counting or overlapping of the criteria. But these 2 steps are quite commonly used in different MCDA methods also, and you can find a lot of literature in. But for the final step, criteria final selection, in MAMCA, we don't have the literature about how to select the final criteria sets for the different stakeholder groups, especially with the stakeholder involvement. So what we normally do previously is that for each of the stakeholder group, we ask the members to select the relevant criteria, and we just select the criteria that most of the members think relevant. So to translate it in mathematics, we have n criteria and n stakeholders. So we got binary criteria score matrix, n times n matrix, which the score are 0 or 1. And we just column sum this matrix, get the score vector. We just select the subset of the vector that's the number of, and which has the criteria, this subset of the vector has the highest score that and also the number of the criteria meets this, which is the number of criteria we define. But there are some limitations for this, for the conventional way we do. So first of all, the intensity of the relevance is not shown. So we just ask them to ask the stakeholders to select the relevant criteria or not relevant. So it's a binary selection. We don't know the relevance level for different criteria. And also, the heterogeneity of the group is not shown. And there's an implicit unfairness. So for the stakeholders, they can select as much as they want for the criteria. So they can select all the criteria and think, they are all relevant to me. But there are some stakeholders just think, there are only a few criteria and think that are relevant. So here we propose a new criteria selection model, and this is the way how we collect the raw data. So for each stakeholder group, the stakeholders select the beta relevant criteria to them. The beta meets the Miller's magic numbers, and then we ask them to give the score based on relevant level in a 1 to x Likert scale. So for one stakeholder, at least one criteria must be given x. By this, we get a new score matrix, and the score basically range from 0 to x. Then we're considering to do a column operation by normalize the scores of the individuals. Here is a simple example. We have a 3 times 3 matrix. We can find out that for stakeholder A1, it gave 5 to all of the criteria. But for the others, it don't give all 5. So implicitly, it has higher weighting power for stakeholder A1 because it gave more scores. So what we do is normalize the column of matrix. So it becomes like all of the stakeholders, they just distribute 1 to the different criteria. What we do next is to consider the variance of the criteria score. So the row operation. Again, this matrix, we can find out that for C1 and C2, if we just get the mean value of it, they have the same score. But actually, C1 has better mutual consents than C2. If we put the score given in what we call profile distribution matrix, we can find out the C2 is more spread out, the scores are more spread out. So what we consider is we consider the variance of the score given. We get the final performance score on the raw value by getting by considering the variance of the distribution. And what they want to do next is to combine these both operations. We first do the column-wise normalization, and then what we do is So after we do the column-wise normalization, actually the scores or score giving from the different stakeholders are in different scales. So we try to put them in the same scales again by considering the probability density and distribution. So to choose a suitable interval to put all these scores in again in the same scale. So what we do, so after we do this, we generate a new profile distribution matrix based on these new scales, and we have a performance score based on these new scales. Finally, we want to consider the 0. I didn't mention it before, but here actually 0 has a special meaning because at first the 0 and the 1 to x scores are choosing in different steps. Because we first ask them to select the relevant criteria and not relevant, and then give the score to the relevant criteria. So we think they should be treated differently. And also, 0 has a fixed number of criteria because we ask them to give beta criteria scores. So there are n minus beta times m number of 0 that is fixed, but it's just distributed on different criteria. So we are thinking of a new indicator for 0. So here we just do a non-zero rate, which is a 1 minus the number of the stakeholders think one criteria is not relevant divided by the total number of the stakeholders. So finally, we get the final performance score by considering the non-zero rate and also the performance score on the new distribution scale. Then we do a Pareto analysis by reordering the criteria set from based on the score and from the highest to the lowest, we first determine the minimum subset by solving the following optimization problem. The minimum number y bar of criteria will be found so that the sum aggregate score will be at least take up alpha of the total score. First, we set the alpha equal to 50% to satisfy the majority rule. And then this should be result that the number of the criteria from 1 to 9. Otherwise, we will increase until the number reaches to 5. We say this subset of the criteria are in the definite zone are the criteria we must select. And then, if number of criteria obtained is already equal to 9, so we do nothing. Otherwise, we further increase the alpha value until the y bar equal to 9. So we call this part of the criteria in flexible zone, which are the criteria we are optionally to be selected. So to validate this framework, we applied it in a real-world construction logistic project. So there is a construction site is built in Andela, a municipality of Brussels, and here, and the different stakeholders are evaluate construction logistic scenarios. But here, what we only consider the criteria pre-processing for one stakeholder group, citizens. So first of all, the criteria initial selection, we get this long criteria list based on the literature, especially for the Brussels construction site literature. And we found out that there are three criteria: impact of construction works on transportation infrastructure rules, accessibility, diverted traffic due to construction site may lead to the double counting and overlapping. So we regroup these three criteria together in the second step, criteria filtering, and we got the final 21 criteria set. So in the criteria final selection, we ask the citizen to select 9 relevant criteria. So the beta equal to 9, and then we ask them to give the scores based on 1 to 5 Likert scale. We get the respondents from 40 stakeholders, 40 citizens, so we got the 21 times 40 matrix. And we first do the column-wise normalization. Next, we try to rescaling the scores. We consider the definition similarity of the histogram because it also gives the optimal interval for the data based on the data range. So we use the Friedman-Diaconis rule to find out the optimal interval. So finally, we get a new profile distribution matrix from 1 to 11, and then we also consider the non-zero rate. So the final score here is calculated by the equation given at the right side, non-zero rate times the final performance score based on the matrix. So then we do the Pareto analysis like this. We finally find out 9 criteria. And 5 are selected belong to the definitive zone, and 4 are the flexible zone. We compare this result with the previous study on this construction site. We find out 2 new criteria that are not found out in the previous in the criteria selection in a conventional way. And we also try to compare the data. So we find out that the left side is a criteria selection in conventional way, just select relevant criteria and not relevant, and you can see the number of stakeholders selected relevant for different criteria. We can find out that there are some tied up criteria, which is hard to decide if you want to stop like somewhere, but they are tied up. You don't know which one to keep, which one to leave. But for us, for the new criteria selection model, it is explicit ranking without the ties. So in this work, we define the new criteria preprocessing framework, and it is a formal guideline serves for identifying criteria sets for decision making. It provides explicit ranking list without ties and guarantee the equality of stakeholders and consider the distributions of scores on different criteria. So thank you. question? Yes.
So thank you, it was very understandable. I was wondering, how did you actually interact with the stakeholders, and did you learn anything, like, was there some need that wasn't met? For example, was some stakeholder, did they want to do something that was not possible with this method, for instance? So were there any insights that you learned?
What the insight you mean based on this selection?
Yeah, when you interacted with the stakeholders.
Impact of the stakeholders, sorry.
So how did you interact with the stakeholders?
Okay. So
let's keep at that. Yeah, that's my question.
I mean, what we do is like because it's done in the COVID. So what we just do in the survey, we did a survey for the resident who lives around the construction site, and we just collect the final results based on on internet. So there's no directly interact with it.
And how many criteria were they supposed to choose?
21.
21?
Yeah.
So was everybody fine with it?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
And that's why we first asked him to first select 9 criteria, because we want to make sure the judgment will not be close if we directly select, to read the 21 criteria in one time, because that's too much.
Okay.
Yeah, I was wondering, because when you presented the list of criteria, I think you mentioned that came from the literature, but you also mentioned that it came from specifically the construction context in Brussels. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how you came up with that list.
So it's just for this question. Yeah. Actually, is so we already have a lot of projects on these studies, and we have we have a lot of projects, and this actually is based on the previous publication, and it is also all the criteria are based on the previous study we already did on the construction side, especially the collaboration with the Brussels government. So that's where we define this criteria.
Yeah, so that's it. It's not necessarily in the literature, it is your previous paper, but that's also derived from the actors involved.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay.
Okay. So, no question. I'll move to next one. Next speaker is Shary Heuninckx. The topic is about frameworks to reach sustainable consensus in the multi-action, multi-criteria analysis. Sorry, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I'm a colleague of River, so I also work a lot with MAMCA as a social scientist. I'm less experienced in the mathematical aspects of MCDA methods, but more in the way to implement them and how they're used by the stakeholders themselves. Let's see. So the added value of MAMCA as an MCA methodology is that the final decision, or like the end ranking, isn't determined by calculating the ranking, but by calculating the preference rankings of the stakeholders individually, and then let them discuss within the workshop if they can find a consensus on the final decision. Now, it's not because we have a consensus among stakeholders that this decision is also the most sustainable solution. It's the most supportive, but not the most sustainable. So we try to look into extra frameworks that we could add to MAMCA to add that sustainability aspect or put more focus to that. For that, we also looked into a specific user case that we used MAMCA with to test out this framework. So it's an industrial site near the city of Leuven that wanted to set up an energy community, which means they wanted to install PV panels within that site and do that in a joint way. There are different ways to do that, so they wanted to decide which form should this energy community take on. So we had 4 alternatives: just do nothing, leave it as it is, have no renewable energy. The second one is to jointly invest in PV panels on 1 or 2 rooftops, let the company on which rooftop it is installed get the benefits, but also return them some money to all the investors. The third one is setting up an actual physical energy community in which new infrastructure is built that connects all the companies so they can physically exchange their excess or their shortage in energy. And the fourth one is sort of a in the middle scenario in which the current energy network is used to exchange energy between companies, but they all install PV panels in this scenario. The relevant stakeholders in this are the companies, the DSO, which is the owner and manager of the existing grids, the groundkeeper of the site, and the municipality. So first we did a regular MAMCA with them, in which they could choose out of a long list which are the relevant criteria. Through pairwise comparison, we also let them attribute a weight to their criteria. And then we asked some experts to evaluate the different scenarios on each of the selected criteria for the stakeholders. This gave us this result, a reference ranking of the scenarios for each of the stakeholders, in which we saw most of them did kind of have the same idea except for the DSO. But through consensus, it was established that the aggregation scenario would be the one that could be supported by all, implementing a couple of safety measures that were very important for this DSO, as they said before. So they were fine with it as long as some additional measures were taken. Now, as said, we had a consensus, but we still don't know whether it was the most sustainable solution. Therefore, we thought of 3 frameworks to assess this sustainability and see if they could be added to the MAMCA in the future. The first one is MAMCA itself doesn't have a stakeholder weighting. All the stakeholders get the same voice within the discussion. But here we decided let's add a weight to each of the stakeholders and see if what the result will be. The weights that we attribute to the stakeholders is decided by how big their impact is on the 3 different pillars of sustainability. For that, we did an MCDA. We asked experts to assess, or you can use experts, or you can use your decision maker or your initiative initiator to assess which of the stakeholders, pairwise comparison of A each B, has the most impact on sustainability, or whose decision reflects the sustainability pillar the most. So we did this for the 3 pillars, and this resulted in a score for each of the stakeholders that reflects how sustainable their own decisions might be. We added this weight to the results of MAMCA, and saw that the result when we gave stakeholder weighting was more or less the same as the result from the consensus ranking. The first and the last one were exactly the same, which learns us that the consensus result is quite sustainable according to this framework. Now, for the first exercise, we gave a similar weight to the 3 pillars, but we also tested it with different weights for the different pillars. We saw that the weights of the stakeholders varied a little bit, but the end result was the same with all exercises. Now, what are the positives of this framework? Well, it brings the sustainability element more to the forefront than in a regular MAMCA. You can do a robustness testing of your initial results from MAMCA. And instead of having it as a different framework in which you compare the different results, you can maybe also use it to add as a discussion element in MAMCA. See, if we gave you weights, this would be the result. Does that influence your consensus making discussion? What is the negative on this framework? First of all, this stakeholder weighting is kind of subjective. It depends on the allocator of the weights. And when you put it next to MAMCA, it might also give more weight to the sustainability aspect and let decision makers decide, okay, we will follow the result from this framework and not from the consensus making. So So you're not sure if the results from both are different, that this result will be supported by the stakeholders because they decided to block on something different. So that might be negative. A second framework we designed wasn't already existing. It was applied to a previous process called MISTO, where sustainability assessment is completely different or completely non-linked to the MAMCA itself. It's where an MCDA is done to decide which of the scenarios is intrinsically the most sustainable solution. So in this, you decide which of the criteria that can be linked to each of the 3 sustainability pillars. We use experts for that. For example, the economic pillar can be represented by lower energy bill, grid reliability, image, etc. We do this for the 3. These experts also gave weight to these sub-criteria for each of the 3 pillars. And then we assessed all the different scenarios on these different sub-criteria. So the preferences of the stakeholders are not taken into account in this assessment. It's just pure sustainability assessment. We again applied this to our pilot sites, and the outcome was also kind of the same as the consensus making outcome. We had the first and the last one in the same place, so it was quite comparable. So we could say, okay, even intrinsic value, the consensus result is quite sustainable. The pros, more or less the same as in the previous framework, again, more focused on the sustainability elements. The intrinsic sustainability value gets more to the forefront. It can again be added as an element in the stakeholder discussion instead of like a separate assessment. And when you add it to this stakeholder discussion, it might lead to some small adaptations of your initial scenarios. Maybe it gives the stakeholders some ideas how to tweak or adapt the initial scenarios and do the MAMCA all over again, like put it into an iteration loop with these new scenarios. The negatives is that it's 2 completely separate assessments. It's very difficult to integrate both. Again, one of both will probably be chosen by the final decision maker, so you lose a lot of the value if you can't integrate both of them. And this gives also less attention to minority voices because in this framework, the stakeholder preferences are not taken into account at all, just next to the MAMCA results. And then the third framework we thought of is just keeping the MAMCA as it is with no separate assessment, but adding an additional stakeholder that is a representation of the next generation. It's kind of a fake stakeholder, but that's gets represented by an expert or by someone who knows a lot about sustainability or future evolutions. So you add them into the full process of MAMCA. Here we asked some experts, what do you think would be the criteria of this next generation? And try to select a couple from all the different pillars of sustainability. So we have, for example, a lower energy bill, electricity bill, a reduced ecological footprint, a fair cost distribution, which means that the costs of this new system, as well as the benefits, are distributed equally between the whole society. It's not that everyone pays for the new system, but only a couple get the benefits from it. Also, innovation they chose, and knowledge sharing and community building. They thought those were criteria that would be very important for this next generation. We also asked them to give a weight to them. And because we already did the MAMCA and the consensus discussion, we could not redo this whole process with this added stakeholder because that would influence the result a little bit. But we looked at what is the results for this stakeholder in SE, and we saw that the ranking was more or less the same as the consensus ranking. So for this pilot case, we could conclude that should this next stakeholder representation be one of the stakeholders, the result would have been kind of the same. But we should test it on a real case in the future to see what influences. Now, what are the positives? This sustainability element is directly inputted within the whole MAMCA process, discussion process, and the workshops. So it's not something that is calculated next to it and then compared with each other. It makes sustainability more concrete by putting a face on it, which means if there is someone literally at the table representing that aspect, it has a much bigger impact than if it's just a piece of paper with some numbers on it and an expert ID on it. We saw that it has much more influence that way. Another positive is it's integrated in one framework. You don't have two results that you have to decide upon afterwards, so it leads to one end result. And the end result is also stakeholder support. You have this whole consensus making, and you can be sure that all the stakeholders that were around the table agree with the end results and will support it when it's implemented. Negative, again, is this representation of the next generation. It might depend on who is representing the stakeholder, who is at the table, and which criteria are chosen. So, and it is just an overview of the main elements of these three frameworks. We decided not to do an evaluation of these three frameworks, like which is the best to implement. They all have their pros and their cons, and I think it depends on the situation itself, or maybe the priorities you have as an initiator, choosing which framework you can add to this. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks for the presentation. Are there any questions?
Just a remark. I was a little bit confused by sustainable decisions. I was wondering if you are looking for decisions which are sustainable in such a way that the decision makers stay with them over a long time. And so I was surprised by the content. And then I'm wondering if you have a group of decision makers and then add this number 3, the fictitious one, perhaps to offend the original decision makers, or are you clear that you find old-fashioned persons who have nothing about sustainability in their mind? Or do you want to dose the person, the fictitious person representing the future, to enlarge that if you think as a moderator that the other side, especially old-fashioned? So,
well, the idea of MAMCA is to actually do it before the decision is made and before maybe the old-fashioned thinkers can have their input. You give input to these decision makers. So they're often not around the same table. We put all the stakeholders around the table, and each of the stakeholders has an equal voice. And by bringing this extra element in it, we don't want to overpower it, but just give it an equal voice and hope that maybe some seeds are planted in the decision makers' head. They don't have to follow everything they say, but at least you give them a forum to also give them their opinion, their ideas, and put it next to all the other ideas that there are. So you choose between them, but at least they get a forum and we get around the table.
that's planting the bias.
Maybe something like that, because it's very difficult to get that within a discussion. It's always something not feasible. It's a sustainability aspect, or it's not real, it doesn't exist, it's something from the future, and then it's easy to put it aside, I think. But when you give a form to it and you actually confront the decision makers that it represents a person in the future, but it does represent something real and tangible, then we hope it might have a bigger impact. I never know. Still, this consensus making is often just used as an input for the decision makers, but it's not the decision making itself. It's just something we often like see. If you decide it in this way, then you know that all the stakeholders will support your decision and will help you implement it so that we can do it. This is the key insight.
Yeah, I also have the question about the consensus, as you said, like, for example, the Nisto case. I mean, I think in the view, we can say that the different, so the final alternative result, luckily for the final result, it has the same, for example, the same ranking of the alternatives as the norm, as the different stakeholders do. I mean, most of the stakeholders do. So, I mean, we can say, this is a sustainable solution, and everyone is happy with that. But what if it is against that? I mean, it is totally reversed. Should we follow the main trend like most of the stakeholder group do, or we just do the sustainable solution?
Well, the idea is to put them at the table at the beginning before a consensus is made between the other stakeholders. So it's just one of the stakeholders, and we don't know what the result would have been without them. So they're there at the beginning, and they're one of the stakeholders who need to be formed a consensus with. So probably the end result will be a bit different, because the things they bring to the table will maybe make the others think about aspects they haven't thought of before, or change their minds, who knows. So I would presume if their result was totally different, that the consensus was also different, because the effect of the DSO that had a different preference ranking than the other ones could be seen in the end ranking. There were two that were switched, and that was the result of this person being at the table. So if there's another person with a totally different ranking around the table, I would assume that the end ranking would be influenced by that.
Yeah, thank you so much. Very interesting. I was just wondering also, like, because this is very confrontative, like in the sense that this round table, everybody puts an opinion, and some cultures maybe you're not confrontative and don't want to share your opinion. So maybe how to reduce this bias in a way, or in a way maybe to include a survey or some way that this person not, openly needs to share or defend an idea, or what are your thoughts about this?
Well, we did some MAMCAs all around the world, and we saw that the role of the moderator is very important in this one. So we pre-calculate their rankings, but then we make sure that we attribute the same amount of time to each of the stakeholders to express their thoughts, to explain to all the others around the room why their preference ranking looks as it does, so that they have to listen to each other and hopefully understand and creates some empathy, for each other. So it's mainly the role for the moderator, I think, to make sure that not one person overrules everyone else. Still, with the consensus making, it's very difficult to make sure that everyone's view is in there in the consensus. That's difficult.
As an analyst, if you do the MAMCA and reach a consensus, and then you realize, okay, maybe we have left out an important stakeholder group like the next generation. What is your perception? Is it advisable to introduce a virtual stakeholder group, so to say, like you mentioned, or to do another iteration and to try to include them from the beginning? What is the better way to do it? If you have some experience with this.
We haven't, but I would presume it's easier to do some desk work or desktop work beforehand and test out what do you think might be the result from that extra stakeholder. And if it's, as in this case, it's more or less the same, then it might be interesting to just add it to the consensus making. Say, yeah, we also calculated it for stakeholder, or these next generation stakeholder, and we think it will be more or less the same. But when you have some doubts and you think it might influence the result, I would propose to do it. Because in the end, you will have some problems anyway or some resistance, and then you have to go back to the beginning. For sure. So.
Okay, so thanks for your presentation. We still have a lot of time. Our next speaker is Sebastian Schär. The topic is from University of Duisburg, and the topic is multi-actor, multi-criteria analysis of emission abatement and energy efficiency measures in container terminals. Sebastian, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. As you may have noticed, I'm not Erik Pohl, who is going to present today. He made it to Helsinki, but not to Aalto for some reasons. So I'm going to hold his talk now, so please be gentle. I'll try my best. I want to talk about the selection of emission abatement and energy efficiency measures in container terminals with the help of MAMCA. And for this, I will first talk about some stakeholders, some important stakeholders in container terminals, some measures for emission abatement and what actually is emission abatement in container terminals. Then briefly about the MAMCA methodology, because we have heard it and you can present it better than I think. And then I want to give the case study with some actual results and alternatives and criteria we selected for this decision process. So, first of all, who are important stakeholders in container terminals and what actually and why do we want emission abatement measures in them? So, the objective of our case was the identification and evaluation of energy efficiency and emission abatement measures at the same time to increase the eco-efficiency and the sustainability basically of container ports. This is a complex issue because you are facing objectives from multiple dimensions, so the methods of multi-criteria analysis are pretty suitable for a topic like this. And since you have multiple actors, which you can see here on the right hand side, So what are your actors? You have public interests on one hand, you have the port authority, you have ship operators and ship owners actually, who are interested in an efficient operation basically of the harbor, which should not be compromised by these measures. Then you have the local residents, who are most likely interested in environmental objectives or criteria. And then the general public interests, which are much more on the global scale, on a broader scale than the residents' objectives. And then, of course, working in between this field of tension is the port operator, who is responsible for selecting and actually conducting these measures. So he has to work in this field of tension of all the stakeholders, and his decision maker in this case, and target of huge conflict, so to say. So to work out some measures and to assess the measures, we use the multi-actor, multi-criteria analysis. You can see here the framework, it's just a slightly different representation. We did like you presented. We selected possible alternatives, which in this case are the energy efficiency and emission abatement measures. We did a stakeholder analysis and looked what are the important stakeholders, and then we assessed the criteria, or we selected criteria in cooperation with the decision makers. We elicited the weights, so the preferences and objectives of the different stakeholders in the first step. And then we have kind of preliminary decision table or performance matrix. And the next step then, we elicited the performance of the different alternatives, which were determined beforehand, on the selected criteria by the stakeholders. And then in the next step, of course, we did the evaluation according to MAMCA. In our case, we used Promete as an aggregation procedure, because we've heard you can apply multiple aggregation procedures in the MAMCA framework. And we use Promete in our case because we have criteria on very different units of measurement. We have CO2 emissions, we have economic values, and we have kind of intangible values like image, for example, or the operational effect of these measures for the port operator. So for this, Promete is really suitable because it can cope with these criteria on different units of measurement. Maybe for some of you who are not familiar with the Promete method, just a small example how it works and why is it so suitable for criteria on different units of measurement. Here we have a small example. On the left-hand side, we have the criteria on CO2 emissions. CO2 emissions can be expressed in CO2 equivalent units, so as a unit of measurement. And we have here as an example 3 alternatives with performances 6, 10, and 8 on any chosen unit of measurement. In our case, it can be kilograms of CO2 equivalents, for example. And then, as Promete is an outranking method, you do these pairwise comparisons of alternatives on each criterion. So, in this example, you want to compare alternative 3 with alternative 2. So, you calculate the difference in the performance on this criterion of each pair. And if you compare alternative 3, which has a value of 8, with alternative 2, which has a value of 10, you get a difference of 2. And since you want to minimize the CO2 emissions, of course, you have to revert it. So this is why there's a 2 and not a minus 2. And then in Promete, contrary to the value theory, you have generic preference functions. So you don't have to elicit your preference function. You have 6 generic preference functions given you can choose from. In this case, you have a linear preference function. So you can see that in this preference function, the difference of 2 leads to a preference indicator of 0.5. So if you translate it to here, you can see that this difference of 2 in this pair of alternatives leads to a preference indicator of 0.5. And this is how the transformation is happening from specific units of measurement, like CO2 emissions, to a dimensionless preference indicator between 0 and 1. So each pair of alternatives gets transformed in such a dimensionless measurement. And by this, you can compare the alternatives on these different criteria on different units of measurement. And then you just aggregate over all criteria and alternatives and incorporate the criteria weights to get a global preference indicator for each alternative, basically. Okay, this was a short introduction to the Promete method. Now, some background on the container terminals. How are they working? You can see the schematic here on the left and on the right, a real-world picture. So at the bottom, the container ships are arriving, or in the past, sometimes not, but usually they arrive. And on them are containers. There are 2 standard sizes of container, 20 foot and 40 foot equivalent units. So you have 2 standard sizes, and these containers get unloaded then onto the shore by container cranes, which take up a lot of energy. So this is why energy-saving measures might be important in container terminals. Because a lot of equipment is using a lot of energy, basically. Then these containers get transferred to the horizontal transfer equipment, like the straddle carriers, they are called. Yeah, and this horizontal transport measures will transfer the containers then to some additional yards before the containers are then loaded to either trucks or trains to be transported into the hinterland, so-called hinterland. So this is how a general layout and how a container terminal operates. Now, as I mentioned, we selected, we want to compare and select different measures for energy and emission reduction in these container terminals. What could be such measures? So here we have 4 selected measures, but in total we examined 14 measures. So there are 14 alternatives. And 4 selected measures could be, for example, the installation of solar photovoltaics on each roof building of administrative buildings in these container terminal. You did not see the administrative buildings in the picture before, but there is also some space for this where photovoltaics could be installed. Then you could also use so-called LNG power packs. So the purpose of these power packs is that when the ships are arriving, you can supply them with such an LNG power pack so that they can turn off their engine actually and saving energy by this. These have quite a huge capacity of up to 30 megawatts, these power packs. And they are fueled by LNG, which maybe is also not the best alternative anymore. Okay. Another alternative is onshore power supply. So you connect the vessels when they arrive at the harbor with the electricity system or grid, basically, of the harbor. So they can switch off their engines and save some diesel fuel mostly. But of course, this measure also depends on the energy mix which is locally used at the harbor in terms of emission abatement, of course. The energy remains the same. We also have the possibility for full electric propulsion of these straddle carriers for horizontal transport. So these are mostly diesel fueled, but you could also switch them to electric motors, and then you have also potential for emission reduction. This is the final criteria hierarchy we worked out, or we pre-selected. It targets most dimensions, or should target all dimensions from sustainability, like environmental, economic, and social. And we also have technical objectives included to assess the port operations, basically. So the port operator really wanted these technical ones also to be considered. These sub-goals, where the criteria have been derived from, address multiple goals from the SDGs by the United Nations. Which you can see here on the left, and the interactions between the sub-goals and the SDGs. And as you can see here, the criteria are really measured on very different units of measurement. So this allows us to consider a huge variety of environmental and economic performance of these measures into the analysis. Okay, then the next step, as mentioned, the stakeholders elicited we elicited the preference of the stakeholders. So the stakeholders gave their weights for all the criteria. And you can see here, maybe additional note, we elicited the weights with the revised Simon's method. So the method of cards, where stakeholders were handed out cards, and each criterion was written on a card, and they ordered these cards according to the relative preference of a criterion. So they placed these cards in an order, and at the top of the order was the most important criterion of these criteria, and at the bottom the least important criterion. And from this you can then derive the criteria weights, basically. And this is the result of this weight calculation procedure. And you can see that the economic criteria are rated as quite important, while the Port Authority and the Port Consulting are also rating the environmental criteria quite high. So total we have 4 stakeholders here with some diverging assessment of the criteria reports. Then the next step is the determination of the performance values of the 40 different measures on these criteria. And for the environmental performance, we conducted life cycle assessments. A life cycle assessment is basically the quantification of the environmental impacts of an alternative. So you determine all the energy and mass flows basically, of the system or of a process or a product. And then by having this balance sheet of inputs and outputs, you can determine the environmental impacts of it, basically. So as a result, you get a measure of, or reference unit, basically, that determines the environmental impact in terms of a specific number. So the output of these life cycle assessments was, for example, if I go back one slide, then the global warming potential in the CO2 equivalent units per year, the particulate matter formation per year, the terrestrial acidification, and the photochemical smog also was given as a specific value then as an output of these life cycle assessments. We also had a simulation model of the container terminal to determine the performance regarding the energy savings. So we can, with the simulation model, determine the effect on the energy consumption by applying the different the measures. Yeah. And yeah, we also did some cost estimation methods and expert interviews for soft criteria or intangible criteria like implementation effort, employee acceptance, and image promotion, which were measured in points. This is the result for the port operator. You can see here on the horizontal axis, you can see the 14 measures, and on the vertical axis, you can see the preference indicator for these different measures. The most important bar for this part is the orange one. This is the net Promethy net score according to Promethy 2, which is kind of the aggregated preference indicator. So it lies, as mentioned, between 0 and 1, and you can see that the alternative of hydrogen fueled straddle carriers is mostly preferred, or preferred the most, because it has the highest Promethy 2 score overall. So these are ordered according to their assessment according to Promethy 2. So this is kind of also the ranking of measures. Yeah. This is for the stakeholder port operator. Then the port authority has a slightly different assessment, but you can also see that the hybrid straddle carrier measure is preferred, slightly preferred over the full electric straddle carrier measure. Okay, maybe just one more slide, which I think is a very interesting way of displaying results. It's the so-called Promethy Gaia plane. In the Gaia plane, you can really summarize all the results pretty nice in a two-dimensional space. So what the Gaia plane does, does a principal component analysis of all the criteria. So it reduces the dimensions basically, because you have as many dimensions as criteria if you want to display the results, and the principal component analysis basically reduces it to a two-dimensional space in this case. So you can see here, these sticks are the so-called decision sticks. And these display the preference of each decision maker. And you can see that the criteria, which are displayed on the rays, on the lines here, they are the criteria that match the preference of a decision maker. So if the decision stick and the criterion point in the same direction, it means that this criterion really discriminates or is relevant for the preference of a decision maker. And if we now zoom out a little bit, we also see here the alternatives, and we can see the alternatives that lie within the preference of the decision maker. So if you prolong the decision stick, you can see which alternatives is more preferred or less preferred by the specific decision maker in this case. And then the distance means how much an alternative actually is preferred. Similar alternatives are represented by points which are located relatively close to each other, and alternatives which are good on a particular criterion are actually represented by points located in the direction of the specific criterion grain. Okay, I think the novel thing here is that we displayed all the decision sticks of every stakeholder on the same figure, basically. Usually you find only one decision stick, so this is a nice adaptation, I think, for the MAMCA procedure with property. Okay, to sum up, this is the multi-actor analysis. You can see we choose, like proposed, equal stakeholder weights. So every stakeholder was given the same weight. And overall, the propulsion hybrid trajectories are actually preferred, which is quite logical. An additional comment is, or the next step could be in the further research, of course you don't have to select only one measure. You could also implement multiple measures. And then you have a portfolio problem, portfolio decision analysis problem, and this is what my colleague is actually now doing. So if you're interested in this, please don't hesitate to contact him. And I will now try to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions? Yeah.
Thank you, Sebastian. Interesting. I was wondering, because in Prometi you have these curves, right, that you use. Did you also involve any stakeholders in getting sort of the shape and the slope of these curves?
You have 6 generic functions you can choose from, and the stakeholders should choose the generic function according to their preferences. So the shapes are like linear or stepwise and so on, and you should ask the stakeholder, which shape matches your preference profile the best. And then you can also, or should also determine the thresholds together with the stakeholders, because the preference threshold, basically, where it gets to 1 in our example. Stakeholders have to determine it, Usually you can make a pre-selection and ask him, this is okay or not, and then you can refine. So this would be a feasible process, I think. Because otherwise it's cognitively too demanding for him to do it all at once, I think. So there are some hints in the literature how to start it, or how to make a proposition, and then really interact with the decision maker.
Just to clarify, did you also involve these stakeholders in this specific case? For the T-shape?
It was before my time.
It's a joint project, and and we did the project. It was a 2-year project with the number of Hamburg, and we explained the method, and we asked that people for the Simon's method as Sebastian. It's real world data, but now we further elaborate that and try and test some things from MAMCA and so on.
Now, this is general, I quite like the fact that in Prometi you have to think about how these curves look, right? So that also leads to a very interesting discussion. Okay, when do we actually then hit the 0 and the 1, right? So even that is valuable.
Sometimes if you explain too much, they become suspicious and think that there are ways to transform it in such a way that you get the wanted result. And so it's sometimes a challenge to have it balanced somehow. And I would say, of course, that the outcome depends on the alternatives and the raw data. So if the alternatives are very different and easy to distinguish, then any method will come up with the same order. But if they are very close together, and you have to figure out and so on, and then it's a very sensitive decision, and then it's jumping around.
I'm curious about how many stakeholders were involved in the whole process. Like each stakeholder group has a certain amount of representatives, I presume. How many were there in total?
I would say something like 11 persons altogether. It was on the second slide was a group of representatives, and it's very much with the course authority and the course operator and so on. And we haven't included population around because it was a research project and they must be very careful in Hamburg to do something because the tower is in the middle of the tower and they are very sensitive to anything. And for that they tried to, they tried to do some innovative things. And perhaps we had I don't know which version of your approach we had in mind. We tried to anticipate what the population is saying.
Any other questions? Okay, yeah, I also have one question. So actually, for the multi-active view and Gaia plan, because actually at the beginning of MAMCA, we use the Gaia plan because I think it can provide more information on the preferences of the different stakeholders. But I mean, now we only use multi-active view because I think it's better for the understanding for the different stakeholders and they can know the different preferences from different stakeholder groups. So have you shown the stakeholder groups the Gaia plan or multi-active view? Do they understand it well?
I think it really depends who you are addressing. For stakeholders, I think the ranking is enough. I think we have Eric and I have programmed a web tool, where you have different ways to visualize the results. So for the visualization, we mostly use Prometheus 2, the total order. The Gaia plane is more in-depth, I think, and quite hard to grasp for stakeholders. So I would say when addressing stakeholders, I would refer to Prometheus 1 and 2 visualizations stated in literature. For scientific publications, I think this yields additional insights and is really quite a complex way to display everything. But
I would like to add that I'm always surprised how well it is understood. Of course, without Prometheus 1, as you have described, it's not understandable. But often the decision makers are very happy with that because they get an informed decision. They can somehow imagine that the multidimensional space is projected on the plane, and they immediately understand the multi-criteria character of the problem. Because there might be very different pictures coming out. I had the first time I applied that, there were always the rays tipping into one direction, and but the chosen alternative was in the other one. And then you see that there's something in the logic strange, and it gives so much insight that I think it's very useful. And because if a decision is easy, then you do not apply MAMCA or anything. You just go. Just for the decision.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe one last. Was the end result shown to the stakeholders and discussed with them, and did they agree, or was it just based on their input that the decision was made?
In practice, it was a very nested decision. So the project was funded by the German Ministry for Infrastructure and Transport and so on, and it was done with the Hamburg consultancy, and they were asked to put up some suggestions to the port operator that he could implement, but he has to ask the port authority if he is allowed, and so on. I think they are doing still further calculations, and here we see the simulation model of this entity. They make a very sound evaluation because investments are extremely high.
Okay. No more questions? Okay. So thanks for your presentation, and thanks presenters, and also thanks for the audience. I'm very happy to have you at the very last parallel sessions. As the chair, I will close this session. Thank you.